Hello again. I want to welcome you to the Potrero Hill Archive Project's 22nd annual Potrero Hill History Night and our second History Night on Zoom. I'm Peter Linenthal. I'm the director of the project, but I want to introduce two important people. On my left, Ruth Miller, and on my right, Ergen Gunny, who will be my Zoom doctors tonight in case we have any problems. If you've come to History Nights before, I want to welcome you back. And if you've never been to a History Night before, I'm so glad that you came. And I hope you'll come to more. Hopefully next year we'll have our regular History Night site will be in an auditorium in the neighborhood where we can all get together and share slices of Goat Hill pizza before the live event. The archive project began in 1986 as an oral history project originally. We collect anything connected to Petrero Hill history and try to make it available. You may have met us at the Petrero Hill Festival or History Days at the Old Mint or at one of the pop-up museums we've been having over the last year. Many of our earlier History Nights are on YouTube, and we're recording this one. So if you know people who were not able to come tonight, they'll be able to see it soon on YouTube. I just want to briefly show you, if you're interested in Petrero Hill history, my partner in the archive project, Abby Johnston, and I have written two Arcadia books on the history of Petrero Hill, San Francisco's Petrero Hill and Petrero Hill Then and Now. And those are all available through Arcadia Books or Amazon, of course. I also want to tell you about our new product, our Queen Lily t-shirts. They're part of a story that you'll hear tonight, and they will be available at Christopher's Books later this week. They're $20 each in medium and large. They're available in red or warm beige, and proceeds from their sale will go to the African American Cultural and Historical Society in San Francisco. Also, in the middle of this month, the Archive Project is working on a series of projections from inside a number of neighborhood homes. We're calling it the Petrero Projection Project. These will be historic photos or artwork of the people whose homes they're being projected in. That may sound confusing, but there'll be more information coming soon on the Archive Project's Facebook page and on Nextdoor. Tonight, if you have any questions or comments about anything, please add them to the chat, but we're not going to be able to respond tonight. So make sure to include your email address or your phone number, and we'll get back to you again, not tonight, but soon. Also, the Petrero Hill Archive Project is a nonprofit. And if you would like to donate, the donation information is also listed on chat. There's a URL for PayPal, and there's also Venmo information. again. So just go to chat if you would like to donate. Tonight's program has two segments. The first segment uncovers the history of the Pioneer Square building at 555 Dyer and links that building to the history of Black pioneers who came to San Francisco during the gold rush. That segment is a compressed version of a larger story, which I hope will be appearing in the San Francisco Historical Society's magazine, The Argonaut, in the future. And the second segment tonight is a conversation with Margaret Rice, who came to Potrero Hill 95 years ago. I also want to give many, many thanks to our longtime sponsor, UCSF, and to many, many people who generously donated their time and expertise to make this program possible. I also have a greeting from Phil DeAndrade, known as Goat Hill Phil, who runs Goat Hill Pizza. He's been our MC on many history nights, but he's not able to join us tonight because he is in Portugal. That's Phil in the black fedora with a class of Portuguese students. He's on a roots tour, exploring his family's roots in Portugal, and he sends greetings to one and all, and he'll be back soon. And with that, we will move to our first segment on James P. Dyer, a Black pioneer in San Francisco. James P. Dyer, Black pioneer in San Francisco, Petrero Hill History Night, November 6th, 2021, a program of the Petrero Hill Archives Project. The gold rush is San Francisco's foundation myth, the story of miners, entrepreneurs, bankers, prostitutes, and gamblers from around the world who came in search of instant wealth and built San Francisco almost overnight, the population exploding from 800 to 30,000 in 1 year. Gold rush images, miners, cowboys, and Wells Fargo wagons have become familiar cliches. San Francisco's Gold Rush Harbor was unforgettable. Many of the masts of the more than 600 abandoned ships docked in San Francisco belonged to whalers from New England, whose crews had deserted for the gold mines. New York reporter Bayard Taylor's description of 1849 San Francisco brings it to life. The renowned harbor, crowded with the shipping of the world, mast behind mast and vessel behind vessel, the flags of all nations fluttering in the breeze. The streets were full of people hurrying to and fro, and of as diverse and bizarre a character as the houses. Yankees of all possible variety, native Californians in serapes and sombreros, Chileans, Kanakas from Hawaii, Chinese with long tails, Malays, and others in whose embrowned and bearded visages it was impossible to recognize any especial nationality. But this avalanche of humanity didn't come only for gold. They came to free themselves from bleak futures on prairie farmlands, from political and economic upheaval far away, and from strict social expectations. For Black Americans, it was a place to establish autonomy, to challenge racist laws and the institution of slavery. While some gold rush images are quite familiar, why are the images of Black pioneers so unfamiliar? This large wooden industrial building on Potrero Hill is part of a remarkable and largely neglected history. It was once the Queen Lily Soap Factory, a business originally established by James P. Dyer, a Black gold rush pioneer who came to San Francisco in 1850. James P. Dyer was born a free person of color in 1818 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the same year Frederick Douglass was born. His father, also named James, had probably been enslaved. The name James Dyer is found on both lists of US slave owners and on Jamaican slave registers. I'm struck by similarities between James P. Dyer's birthplace and his later home, San Francisco. New Bedford is long and narrow with 20 piers projecting into the deep waters of a bay, forming a safe harbor near whale migration routes. While the economies of most Massachusetts cities were based on manufacturing, New Bedford's incredible wealth came from maritime commerce. By the 1850s, New Bedford was described as perhaps the wealthiest city in the world, redolent of oil and bursting with promise. Whale oil was the main source for home and industrial lighting around the world, used in soap and to lubricate machinery in growing industrial economies. One whale could provide 3 tons of whale oil, and for 90 years, New Bedford provided over 45% of American whale oil. Whale oil was New Bedford's gold. A local historian tells us that there were 2 New Bedfords, one a fair and dignified city on a hilltop with patrician mansions and opulent gardens, the homes of whaling merchants and their captains. And then the other squalid sections of town where sailors and those who preyed upon them, the saloons, boarding houses, and dance halls where delirium and death were sold. There was even a brothel in a grounded whaling ship in the center of town and 78 liquor shops. James P. Dyer grew up in the south end of New Bedford, where children begged for food, a neighborhood still home to many people of color today. The whaling industry was extremely dangerous, but more open to people of color than many others. We see this in the crew of Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick, which was inspired by the true story of the whaler Essex. However, the Essex's crew was forced to resort to cannibalism, a fact which Melville left out. New Bedford had a reputation as a place of refuge for escaped enslaved people, with up to 700 fugitives living there between 1854 and 1863. Near the waterfront, James P. Dyer's family ran a small, crowded boarding house next to a pond on South Water Street, catering to about 20 Hawaiian seamen hoping to find whaling jobs. James P. Dyer probably attended an African Methodist Episcopal church where he could have heard the eloquent sermons of Frederick Douglass, who had recently escaped slavery in Maryland and come to New Bedford with his wife on the Underground Railroad. In 1834, New Bedford suffered its first terrifying outbreak of cholera, which was part of a pandemic that swept across Asia, Europe, and then into the Americas. Cholera was called the blue disease for obvious reasons. New Bedford city officials announced that the source of the outbreak was the Dyer boarding house and cited the filthy conditions and dissolute habits of the tenants. When James Dyer's father heard this accusation, he went into a rage and attacked two city officials with rawhide straps and stones. He was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 4 years in prison. When the time came for his release, his wife, fearing that he would kill her, and his son, James P. Dyer, petitioned authorities to keep him out of New Bedford. Although James P. Dyer's father was prone to violence, racism could easily have played a part in this story. Soon afterwards, when he was 21, James P. Dyer joined a whaling voyage on the Minerva, a ship that was 112 feet long, a merchant ship that had been converted to a square-rigged Yankee Whaler, a kind of floating factory which boiled strips of whale blubber to extract the oil. James P. Dyer was one of 2 African-American men on the crew, and here we see his name on the crew list. A whaler describes a similar ship. The smell of the burning cracklings is too horribly nauseous for description. It is as though all the ill odors in the world were gathered together and being shaken up. From this smell and taste of blubber, raw, boiling, and burning, there is no relief or place of refuge. James P. Dyer spent 3 years on this voyage, which took him to Brazil, around Cape Horn, and to the Bay of Islands in New Zealand, which we see here, before returning home. Back in New Bedford, he became a soap maker and married Sabina Taylor in 1848. Their daughter Anne was born soon after. Meanwhile, Mr. Dyer read newspaper articles about the astonishing amounts of gold coming out of California mines, and about San Francisco, where wages and prices for goods had risen to astronomical heights. Cook's wages are $100 a month, $3,500 today. Eggs, $3 a dozen, $105 today. And it is not uncommon to cart gold dust from one store to another. Black Americans, like thousands of people around the world, saw an opportunity for economic and social advancement and dropped everything to find passage to San Francisco. In 1849, Frederick Douglass wrote in the abolitionist paper, The Liberator, "Not one of the company of colored persons from New Bedford expresses any regret at going to California, and all seem delighted with the prospect before them. For once, labor has found a place where it bids fair to be amply rewarded." In that same issue of The Liberator, in a letter from San Francisco signed by 40 Black men from New England, many of them from New Bedford, the organization of a mutual benefit and relief society was announced, both for themselves and for newcomers, adding that each was doing well, making an impressive $3,500 to $10,000 a month in today's dollars. How could James P. Dyer not go? The Dyer family left for San Francisco in 1850, joining what would become the largest US migration until the 20th century. James was 31, Sabina 25, Anne less than a year. The New Bedford Directory of 1852 lists James Dyer's address and the address of many men from the city as simply California. There were 3 routes west, and 2 were particularly dangerous. The first, quite rough, went overland across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. The second, by steamship to Panama, then by canoe and mule train across the malaria-ridden Isthmus of Panama, where, with luck, one might pick up a steamer to San Francisco. It seems most likely that James Dyer and his family took the route around Cape Horn that he'd taken earlier on a whaler, and then up the coasts of South and North America to San Francisco. The voyage could easily have taken 6 months on a ship like this, advertised as a well-known and splendid little extreme clipper ship. The Dyer family arrived at San Francisco's docks in 1850, and they would have seen either the smoldering ruins from one of 7 fires that burned the city between 1849 and 1851, or the rebuilding that took place almost overnight. Bayard Taylor again helps us see that San Francisco. Every newcomer in San Francisco is overtaken with a sense of complete bewilderment. One knows not whether he is awake or in some wonderful dream. Never have I had so much difficulty in establishing satisfactorily to my own sense the reality of what I saw and heard. The very air is pregnant with the magnetism of bold, spirited, unwearied action. And he who but ventures into the outer circle of the whirlpool is spinning ere he has time for thought in its dizzy vortex. The Dyer family moved to the sandy slopes of Knob, then called Fern Hill, and Russian Hill, high above the waterfront to John Street in a neighborhood called Spring Valley, at that time the sparsely built western edge of the rapidly growing city. Spring Valley's underground springs fed a bathhouse and a dye works on a plot of ground called the Doomed Valley for several businesses which had failed there. Those springs would be useful in the soap-making factory that James Dyer established there in 1852. In this panorama, the small white building is likely that first soap factory. In 1852, the Dyers' neighbors were Australians, Mexicans, Irish, and Germans, but the area soon became the first permanent African-American community in the West. Despite San Francisco's chaos, the Dyers must have felt at home, having moved from the largest community of free people of color in the North to the largest Black community in the West. Between 1852 and 1860, San Francisco's African-American population would almost triple, growing from 460 to 1,175. Most Black residents were literate free people of color from Northeast cities, mainly New York, Philadelphia, and New Bedford, where abolitionism and Frederick Douglass's speeches encouraged the push for equality and human rights. Most Black pioneers were young and adventurous, and the social fluidity of frontier life would have suggested the possibility of racial equality. Other Black San Franciscans came as fugitive enslaved people who mined for gold to buy their freedom. And yet others came with white settlers from southern slave states. When these enslaved people were sent to the gold fields to do the hard work of mining in place of their white owners, it violated the 49ers' code of ethics, which rejected the idea of any man doing another's work. In 1850, the year of the Dyers' arrival, California entered the Union as the 35th state. The unresolved issue of slavery threatened to tear the Union apart. Would California become a slave or free state and tip the balance? Public opinion was complicated. Some proponents of a free California were simply afraid that slaves would unfairly compete with white gold miners. Other white Californians, influenced by popular pseudoscientific theories of phrenology and the recently classified races, which Frederick Douglass called scientific moonshine, wanted to ban all African Americans, free and enslaved, from the state. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California to the Union as a free state, but with provisions that hardly guaranteed freedom. The new state strengthened the fugitive slave law, which required the return of escaped slaves to their owners. It also denied slaves a trial and the right to testify on their own behalf. African Americans in California were also denied the vote, partly from fear that if Black men were allowed to vote, the much larger Chinese community would also demand the vote. In 1850, the euphemistically titled Act for the Government and Protection of Indians wrote into law the virtual enslavement of Native Americans in California. This led to the kidnapping and sale of thousands of Native American children. And it got much worse. In 1852, California passed its own Fugitive Slave Act, which required Black residents to prove they lived in the state prior to statehood. Without that proof, a free Black person could theoretically be sold into slavery. And incredibly, in 1858, the California legislature would pass a law banning Black immigration, although the bill was never enacted. This structural racism stands in stark contrast to the myth of a free California. When Archie Lee, a slave from Mississippi, was brought to California in 1857, he fled and faced being returned to slavery. The Black communities in Sacramento and San Francisco, along with white abolitionists, mobilized and raised thousands of dollars for his defense. They also alerted police about his owner's attempt to kidnap Mr. Lee. This landmark case went all the way to the California Supreme Court, who first ruled that Archie Lee should be returned to his owner. But his supporters rioted outside Kearny Street Hall of Justice, which we see here, where he was being held. And when the case was retried, Archie Lee was judged a free man because his owner had settled in California, a free state. In 1851, James P. Dyer established the New England Soap Factory in Spring Valley through a partnership with Peter Van Winkle, a white Dutch New Yorker. Newspaper ads in 1855 announced, "Soap, soap, soap, candles, candles, candles," at J.P. Dyer's New England Soap Factory. Located on Mason near Pacific, just about above the Broadway Tunnel today. A series of loans, foreclosures, and petitions for insolvency between 1857 and 1866 show that James P. Dyer had a series of financial problems, but the soap-making factory he established continued through partnerships and loans. The award for Best Exhibit of California-made soap went to James Dyer at the 1857 State Fair in Stockton. But by 1862, Mr. Dyer's neighborhood was increasingly residential, and neighbors complained that the effluvia and smoke arising from the soap-making operations are exceedingly disagreeable and have an unhealthful effect upon the atmosphere, and that the stench is so heavy as to kill all the flies in the neighborhood and keep the dogs from howling at night. One of the neighbors who complained was Henry Haight, who lived directly across the street from the factory on Pacific. Mr. Haight eventually became governor of California, and he asserted in his inauguration speech that Reconstruction disenfranchises enough white men to give control to a mass of Negroes just emancipated and just as ignorant of political duties as beasts of the field. Racism certainly played a part in Mr. Haight's complaints against Mr. Dyer. Interestingly, at the trial, fellow soap manufacturers testified, claiming that soap making was actually quite healthy, and they called attention to Mr. Dyer himself, who, weighing about 300 pounds, obviously had robust health. But the jury was not convinced, and in 1864, Mr. Dyer was fined $50 and lost most of his factory, valued at $18,000. He moved his factory to what had become the new southern edge of town, the Petrero, once the pasture land for Mission Dolores's cattle, and where other smelly, dangerous, or disruptive businesses were already located, including soap, gunpowder, and glue factories, and a number of slaughterhouses along Mission Creek. But more significant than Mr. Dyer's work as a manufacturer of soap was his continuing work with and for people of color in California. This community made important contributions to the education, political, legal, and social advancement of people of color in California. In 1862, Mr. Dyer became president of the San Francisco Athenaeum and Literary Society, an organization that provided a free library with 800 books, a reading room, and a saloon where Black men and women could find American and foreign periodicals and the latest newspapers from Europe. The Athenaeum also held lectures and debates and became a Black cultural and political center, a tradition which continues today through the San Francisco African American Cultural and Historical Society on Fulton Street. From the 1830s to the 1890s, more than 200 state and national colored conventions brought tens of thousands of Black men and women together to organize for racial justice. The first California Colored Convention was called for at the Athenaeum in 1855. James Dyer was a San Francisco County representative to that convention, which petitioned the state legislature for the right of colored people to testify against whites. Two famous cases illustrate the racism of the laws at that time. In the first, in 1861, a white man shot and murdered a Black barber whose barbershop was in the Niantic Hotel, a building that had once been a large ship moored in the San Francisco harbor. But because the witnesses were Black, there was no testimony against the murderer, who received a minimal sentence. The second case involved Mifflin Gibbs, who had traveled with Frederick Douglass on an abolitionist speaking tour, and his partner, Philip Lester. The two men established the wildly successful Clay Street Pioneer Shoe and Boot Emporium. When two white men entered their store, stole shoes, and severely beat Lester, Mr. Gibbs was not allowed to testify against them. Mifflin Gibbs became a publisher of the Mirror of Our Times, California's first Black newspaper. Both Gibbs and Lester became leading activists in the Black community, and the two partners refused to pay the poll tax because they could not vote, a move which ended the tax's enforcement. Also, Mr. Gibbs may have hidden fugitive enslaved people in his store's basement until they could secretly board ships bound for South America. The colored conventions also fought for the right to vote for colored men and petitioned for schools for colored children. In 1855, when Mr. Dyer's daughter Anne was 5, she would have walked around the corner to the first segregated school for Black children in California in the basement of St. Cyprian Church, where 45 children of all grades were taught in one classroom. James Dyer was also on the executive committee of the Fourth Convention and served on the Industrial Pursuits Committee, which resolved that our colored traders, mechanics, and manufacturers receive from us every encouragement possible. As president of the Athenaeum, James Dyer endorsed the Pacific Appeal newspaper, founded by Philip Bell, as the official organ of the colored citizens of San Francisco. The paper's motto was, "He who would be free himself must strike the blow." James Dyer was also on the board of trustees of the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, where he served as delegate to an 1863 convention of AME ministers from Pacific states and British Columbia, which had the goal of breaking down geographical barriers and imagining the African American citizens living in different places as one extended Black community. In 1868, Mr. Dyer collected contributions for the Reverend T.M. Ward, known as Old Man Eloquent, who nurtured the AME Church and spoke out against the gold rush's materialistic culture. In 1865, Mr. Dyer's New England soap and tallow factory opened on the site of the current UPS building. But sadly, the new Petrero factory was entirely destroyed only a year later. It seems the Brannan Street Bridge over Mission Creek was closed and fire engines were slow to reach the fire which consumed the building. The 1866 fire loss was estimated at $20,000 and the remaining equipment and materials were auctioned. But in spite of that huge loss, that year, Mr. Dyer served as vice president in charge of a celebration of the second anniversary of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and he would serve as president on the 5th anniversary. James Dyer took a trip to the Calistoga Hot Springs for his health, but on June 17, 1869, James P. Dyer, now 50 years old, died following a heart attack. James P. Dyer was warmly remembered in obituaries and poems to his memory. The Elevator stated, "He was just in all his dealings, strictly honest, temperate in his habits, generous to a fault. His heart was ever open to the calls of distress, and his hand followed the impulses of his heart. Every enterprise which had for its object the progress of our people found in him a steady supporter." The factory would continue as Queen Lily Soap Factory, Fishbeck and Glutes Soap, and Pioneer Soap at 2 more Potrero Hill locations. The second near Jackson Park in 1895, and then in the 1920s, that huge wooden building was moved to Carolina and 18th, where it stands today. A building which is part of a story that has almost become forgotten. Neighbors remember Queen Lily Soap, which continued production into the 1960s. Researching Mr. Dyer and his fellow Black pioneers has been fascinating. And while much of the story was shocking, it was even more shocking to me how little of this history I knew. Bronze plaques honoring James Dyer at the site of his first factory on Mason Street and at the Queen Lily building on Potrero Hill would be a first step in restoring this history. Our country is confronting its record on race, and the stories of these pioneers should become familiar chapters. People of color did not find a promised land in California, but came together to fight for racial equality and had many successes. Celebrating these people and recognizing what they achieved gives us hope in continuing their unfinished fight. And I really want to thank several people who generously contributed to this project: Susan Anderson, Lisa Heyer, Robert Maker, and Hudson Bell. Thank you very much. So I hope you enjoyed that piece. It was totally fascinating to research. And we'll move along now to our second segment, a conversation with Margaret Rice. I know many neighbors know Margaret because she worked for many years at Daniel Webster School. and many others know her through St. Teresa's Church. Margaret is also a member of the 113-year-old Petrero Women's Club, and she extends an invitation that you'll hear in her conversation. If you are interested in the Women's Club, our contact information is in the chat. And again, if you are interested in donating to the archive project, donation information is also on the chat through PayPal and Venmo. And now to Margaret Rice.
Tell me a little about your folks. Where did they come from? My mother came from Castelvetrano in Sicily, and my father came from the north. But those towns, I don't think are there anymore. I think they've been absorbed. Yeah. And so they were there. Papa's uncle, I believe, became a priest and was at the Vatican. My mother had the only stone house with a rambling rose on it and a stone step. And that's, her brothers came over, 4 brothers. Then she was brought over, but Aunt Margaret married and she had children. So she did not come over, but her son is here in St. Louis. You said that your mom had some special abilities. Yeah, Mama was psychic, and she could tell things that were going to happen, have happened. She was at the table, I remember this so well, doing the vegetables, and all of a sudden she looked off into the distance, and she said, somebody died in Sicily. And here would come the black bordered envelope saying so-and-so passed. Great. And you mentioned that Sicilian people in the neighborhood would consult you. Oh my God, yes. All the women would come to Mama, first with their problems. She would advise them. They also brought their mixture of figs to make the fig bars for Christmas. And Mama was an artist. She had a tiny pair of scissors, and she would make birds, fish, artichokes, and you knew exactly what it was. And they were filled fig bars, and they were done at the holiday season. And all these ladies would bring their mixture from my mother to make them into beautiful things. Mama took her wedding gown and made our communion dresses. How she ever had the nerve to cut up her dress like that. But that's what they did. And she was an excellent seamstress, such a good cook that, what was his name? A fireman that lived next door to us came and told me before I lived there. They would visit my mother and father on Pennsylvania Street. Tell his son, come on, we'll go. Mr. Blair will give us a glass of homemade wine. But they went near lunchtime, and he said, and Mrs. Potrero asked us to stay for lunch. And we were poor. We were like 13 or 14 people living in that house. There was my grandmother, my uncle, my cousin Rose, my cousin Josie. My father raised these two. Their mother died, his sister died. So Papa and Mama raised the cousins. And how could you go and visit when you're a fireman? You've got a good paying job, and Mom and Papa would take you, get your wine. That jug was always there on the floor. And all the men ate in the dining room that would come, and we would have to wait. So if there wasn't any chicken left, too bad, dearie. It's that old song, Jim, take cold tater and wait. That's how it was. Once a week, we were each handed an egg to prepare any way we wanted. I always made a custard with my egg, and my brother would steal it. Regular family things. That was fine. And we used to get the liver, heart, and lung from Mr. Dunnigan, the butcher. He would give this to us. And I still resent my brother stealing my custard, because I was the only one that made custard. You know, the others fried them or boiled them or whatever. And there went my custard, Charlie. What can you do?
Charlie appreciated the goodies.
Oh, he sure did. He was great. You know, Charlie was big, muscular.
So he needed those extra calories.
Are you kidding? That guy had he could eat you down. I don't know why Charlie picked on me like that. That's what I keep thinking. Charlie, why did you steal my custard?
Maybe it was the best thing on the table.
It was while I was waiting for it to get cool enough for me to eat. Did I tell you about the cannery? We used to go down the 18th Street Bridge. Now I'm a little kid. The men would come in with their trucks of peaches. We'd stand there and they would throw us a peach. Do you know how wonderful that was? We never bought a peach. But they would make sure that all these kids standing at the rail got a peach to eat, a pear. But somehow we knew that the trucks were coming. So we would get down there. And when I was young, we had wood stoves all the time. There was a coat factory that made the hangers. So all the wood that wasn't usable, we would take a 100-pound gunny sack, that size, and fill it with all the wood pieces to bring home for kindling. And I was walking up the hill with this big sack of wood on my back, and the police came by. Scared the daylights out of me. They put me in the back of the police car and drove me home. A good thing for a child with the police, because people were afraid of the police. You didn't know what was going to happen. And they brought me home. Will they do that today? I wonder. We lived on Carolina, 701 Carolina, which is where Leicester is. There's a lot. And we would get a potato. Everybody had a potato, kids. And the older children built the fire. We threw our potatoes, even though we marked them, we never got our potatoes back. It was fabulous having a roasted potato. You have to remember, we didn't have a lot of things. Mostly it was what we grew. And we had all, as I said, rabbits along there. Chickens. Can't have them today. We shopped off of trucks. The watermelon truck would come and he'd be yelling watermelon. And my dad would go out and get the watermelon to my mother's dismay because she's going to have wet beds with all these children eating watermelon for dinner and homemade bread. So they knew to stop. There was a fish truck, and there was also, my father would go to Chinatown to get the meat. I don't know why he ended up in Chinatown, but it must have been the best. As you know, that was he was a salesman when he was there. And he would do that. And I told you about the funerals. My dad would go to the funeral. First, he'd go to Chinatown, get the meat, throw it on the table and say, Tita, and she would cook the funeral feast. So she never attended a funeral because she was always cooking for them. He went to church and he would put all the people, mostly ladies, the cars were all lined up and he would fill this car and then the next one and you get this one. And he was the last. And if there was anybody left, he would take them to the cemetery. Then they'd come back, he'd come home, get the meal that my mother prepared and brought it to the home. And people would go to that house. Fantastic. I can remember that. So wonderful. My oldest sister, Jenny, couldn't be found. She had the police. And he was looking everywhere also. And he said, don't worry, Mrs. Bolaro, we will find her. Well, they couldn't find Jenny. So he went home, I guess for dinner or whatever. Jenny was at his house playing with his kids. So he brought Jenny home and he said, now, Mrs. Bolaro, you know, don't be upset with her. And she said, don't you worry, I'll take care of her. And she did. I guess Jenny never went somewhere and didn't tell Mama where she was going. So that was one of the big things, the forest on Pennsylvania Street on the west side was a huge forest. Well, not really a forest. It seemed like it to me. My uncle would go there and we would have mushrooms for dinner. After every rain, he would go and pick the mushrooms. And I can remember the silver dollars going in the frying pan with the mushrooms. And if the silver dollar didn't turn dark, the mushrooms were good. Oh, and that was Pennsylvania Street. We had to make our aprons and our little bands for our head, our dish towel and a pot holder. And we had an eye, an electric eye, you know. And so then when you left the low 7, you went to high 7, then you started cooking. And we would cook things on our little oven, or it would go into the big oven, and then we would eat that, whatever we prepared. Then when we became 8th graders, the high 8 had to make their graduation dress. It was teal blue, dirndl, with a little jacket, and Olga helped me finish my little jacket. Fabulous. We used to take cardboard and wax it. And we had to stop where I can't remember the gentleman's name. He didn't want us on his house. But we'd go up the house on Carolina, slide down on the wax cardboard. That was one of the big things for us. You know, we fight over cardboard. So we could come sliding down the hill. Fabulous. I still remember that. And we never got hurt. That's amazing. No, Carolina.
What was?
I was a little kid. See, Kiki was born by then because the window facing 20th Street in Lester's home now, we had our 4 beds up there for the girls, and she was bouncing up and down on the bed. The window was open. Out went Kiki on her stomach. And Mr. Noto saw her fall. So he came over, told my mother, Kiki, and he drove them to the emergency. Kiki lived. It's just amazing. Because that was the second story. I guess you could say the third story, because it was the garage, basement, and first and the second.
Tell me how you came to Potrero Hill.
We lived in St. Louis. I was 6 months old. There was a large mafia contingent there. One day, my dad knew all of them, but he would not join with them. And his friends in the mafia came to him and said, pack what you can, go to a picnic, take the train to Illinois, which was east, but you take the train west and go to San Francisco because they are coming to kill you because you won't join them, which is how I came to Petrero Hill, lived in Florindo's parents' basement. I was but 6 months old, the 6th child.
A basement?
Yeah, we all lived with our basement. When we lived on Pennsylvania, we had our stove down there. Everything was done in the basement except sleeping. And all of us, my grandmother and my uncle slept in the kitchen part. And we were scattered, I don't know where. Don't even know how Mama managed with now 7 children.
What are the first images you remember of the neighborhood?
Oh my goodness. I remember a dog, a beautiful fluffy dog who put his paws on my shoulder and my face into the fur. And I thought I was dying. I don't pet an animal. We had every kind of animal you could think of, but I didn't pet them, and they did not bother me. It's just one of those things. That was one. My mother would put us under her skirt, and my grandmother, if a cup was given out that night, we were allowed to get out, buy a ticket, come in and get the cup. It was broke, always the cup, never a dish. So this pattern to me is absolutely beautiful. I loved it. And I'm surprised that we still have a set.
What movies did you see there?
Buck Jones, Tom Mix. There was an old saying all about Tom Mix. Who's gonna marry Tom Mix? Who else was Gene Autry? We loved the cowboys and the Indians. And if a film broke, we were there doing our feet, making a horrible racket, the poor guy. We also were given a candy bar on Saturday. The show was a nickel. I would sit on the corner and cry because my father wasn't home to give me a nickel to go to the theater. I missed part of the cereal. No. That was awful. And I had to ask the people, what happened with the cereal? Oh, I was so sad. I didn't get to see that portion. But those stars, Lash LaRue, these are people that were part of us, at least to me. It was like they were family. And we loved it, and we called it the Flea House. My brother also worked there. He would clean all the candy bar wrappers, what have you. Sweep out the theater. That was good too. But he never got us in free. My sister Ann was married to this fellow, Reese, and he was in the Navy. He wasn't in the Navy when they married, but he was in Hawaii. And he wrote my sister and said, there's this nice guy, have your sister Margaret write to him. So I did. Willie was lined up with the rest of his crew, and whoever the Navy person was reading the names to go on the ship skipped Willie and then went on with the rest of them. That ship was torpedoed. Everybody on board was killed. Here's my husband standing alone. We wrote for 2 years. He went to the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, all those islands he was on. He did not see any fighting because he was an aviation metalsmith. And he was 2 years we wrote. Willie came through. We were together. He met my family. He went back. He was being discharged. They wore the ruptured duck. Went to New Orleans, was discharged, sent me a telegram. Ruby, my boss, said, you have a telegram, and it said they didn't deliver. Come at once. Crazy me was payday. I went up to my boss, the accounting department, got my check, and he said, but you're coming back. I said, oh yeah, I can't get on a train. There's no reservations. I go home, I get a phone call. There's been a cancellation of an upper berth as far as Kansas City. Do you want it? It's tonight. So I did. I went down to the show, saw my dad. He said, wait, I'll go with you. I said, you can't, Papa, I can't get you on the train. But he was going to come to Nashville with me. Went to Nashville, Willie was there. Went to the Andrew Jackson Hotel. We were married by a judge on my parents' anniversary. The Monte Cristo Club was a place that these men went to, mostly the garbage men, the Sicilians that went to the Monte Cristo when they were off. My brother-in-law Sam belonged to them, and for a few years we had a women's club that would go once a month and have dinner. Fabulous meals. Those men could cook. It was just, something wonderful. And we got to see all these people because you couldn't. They would come to my mother. We went to the 9 o'clock mass every Sunday. And at Christmas, we went to midnight mass. I remember that midnight mass very well. Father Lynch was saying mass. My son was the altar boy. Everybody left church, and my son is still there. He'd look around and, start to get up. Father Lynch would put his hand on his shoulder. We didn't get home until 3 on that Christmas Eve. There was something about the church for me. There was a Father O'Rourke. He had a double confessional. The other 2 priests didn't have anybody. They would come out and say, come over here. He had both sides. lines of people would want to go to Father Olbert. So that shows you what rapport he had with us. You know, why would I remember such a thing? Jude Dreckenbach. Did you know Jude? Oh dear, he knows her. Yeah, David is a doctor, wonderful person. And of course, Jude is lovely, just lovely. I've been so fortunate to meet such nice people. I never felt unwanted. And there are a lot of children that have that. I know a lot of children would come to my mother's house on the way to school and eat breakfast with the poor family. They would eat the oatmeal with us. And then one of them, I remember Argo's mother, said, "Don't you know that woman has so many children? Don't you dare stop and eat breakfast at her house. You've already eaten at home." So why did they want to come to Mama? She always treated everybody beautifully. The Anderson family with her triplets. Now, you know, Elise. Don't you know Elise? We were poor. Catholic Charities bought my graduation dress for me. That was from Everett Junior High. It was a blue chiffon.
How did you happen to join?
I happened to be put up for membership by Mrs. Dunnigan, who lived on the corner. Her husband was the butcher. So she sponsored me. You couldn't just join the Petrero Women's Club. You had to be sponsored. So and at that time it was Mrs. Wifstrand was the president. Bessie Hickman was the secretary. The women were very careful. Now, Mrs. Dunnigan, who sponsored me, was, one of the elders in the neighborhood who was a good woman. What am I going to say? I don't know how to explain it. And her sponsoring me, I was shocked. I thought I was a nobody then. And they asked me, her daughter-in-law asked me, "Would you like to join the Petrero Women's Club?" She was going to be sponsored by her godmother. Okay. I said, "Gee, I would." Because like I said, you couldn't just join. Somebody had to be for you.
Can you read the object of the Women's Club?
Its object shall be civic usefulness and mutual improvement. How true. We did. And we are looking for new members. Come join us. Thank you. When I was accepted into the Petrero Women's Club, it felt like family. I can remember all these ladies, and they were so sweet to me. I was one of the younger women. They were just so good to me to help me with whatever I was doing, teach me some of the things I didn't know about. It was great. I can still see all of them. Hannah Goldstein was just an absolute doll. She was the sweetest person you could probably know, except for Eloisa. Eloisa was my favorite person in church. We had fundraisers, and what we would do would be give money out. The Heart Association, cancer, guide dogs for the blind. There was another one. I can't recall that one. But there was another association that we tried to help. We also donated to the library because we used their
room upstairs. So when they had the art show for we would donate. And to this day, we still donate a very small amount because there are not many members. Come join us. We'd love to have them.
Were you involved with the club when they picketed against a freeway proposal?
I think I was there. I think I have that picture. I think I'm standing near Vera Lynn. I went to the neighborhood house a lot when I used to take my son to the Well Baby Clinic up there. That was a wonderful thing. I had a woman came to give massages free. They asked me if I would be the first to do this. So I did. That was a wonderful thing for me. The neighborhood house was great. I loved Mrs. Maxwell. And there was Bob, who with his camera all the time. I can't say that I had a miserable life. I had my miserable times, but my memories are positive. I just love things that I like to see all of this. I did not appreciate a lot of the change. I'm still old school.
You mentioned cooking connected to Daniel Webster School.
When they started lunches for the children, I had applied for as being an aide in the yard. Instead, they put me in the cafeteria that wasn't there. So while they were building it, Mr. Farrar, who was my boss, came and showed me what to do, and we served the children. I had the most wonderful children after we built the kitchen. They were all from Chinatown. I still have a thing that all the children put in to buy me an ID bracelet. I still have that. And I have a medal from China that shows the tree of life that one of my students brought me back and said she ran out of money, so she couldn't buy a chain. I still have the medal. It's wonderful. They thought Petrero Hill was awful. I remember riding in one of the buses, the little buses that took people around. And she said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Potrero Hill." "Oh, dump." That's what I got. And she let me off on Market Street. She did not take me to the ferry building where I could have gotten a bus more direct. They didn't think Potrero Hill was great. Yeah. Why? Who knows why? It was like a little town. Everybody knew everybody else. You didn't do anything when you were a child because when you got home, your mother already knew it. And you thought she had eyes in the back of her head. How did she find out? That telephone tree was there. You just better not do anything that you shouldn't have done. And how fabulous that was, that no matter where you went, you were welcome. I've been most fortunate in people. I had a good life. I hope I reach 100. It's my goal. Now, one of our ladies is 104. She's a member of the club. She lived on the hill.
Stop share. Wasn't that great? I want to make that Christmas fig pastry that Margaret was talking about. If there's any question about getting in touch with the Petrero Women's Club, this is my contact information, and you can get in touch with me and I will pass that information on to the club. If there was any question about donating, the Venmo information is at Potrero History. Yeah, we do need the recipe for that fig cake, definitely. Well, one other person I forgot to thank is Sue Yaru, who designed this year's poster. Thank you, Sue, you are the best. And Mr. Watt too, of course. So thank you for coming. Looking forward to next year's event, which I hope will be live, and we'll be eating Goat Hill pizza slices. So see you around the neighborhood.